Indeed, I'm very happy to be here with old friends and new friends. And well, I'm not going into further details other than saying that I've loved to work with David Edge in the earlier times. And actually, he and I had a special tie, not just because of our shared interest in teaching STS to science and engineering students, but also in the sense that he was president of 4S and asked me to run as his successor, which I did successfully. And that's a story in its own right, which I'm happy to tell in the break or whenever somebody wants to ask me about. Anyway, for now, I'd like to talk about this sort of cryptic title, Sites of a Grand Societal Experiment. The grand societal stuff may actually have connotations in your mind with the presently fashionable term grand societal challenges that science and technology are supposed to address, or at least some of the organizations, like funding agencies, are supposed to orient their research in that way. So now, actually, there's a new phrase of the various kinds of orientations of research, which is that research can have a challenge orientation. Again, it's a cryptic term, but it resonates with some of the policy concerns. What I wanted to do today actually is inspired by my experiences in South Africa, where I've been going for a long time now, since '96. And there I realized that the so-called third mission of universities, which is a point of debate in many countries, so it's the third mission in addition to teaching and research. But elsewhere than in South Africa, it's a matter of which strategic choices in terms of profiling a university will make. And it's also a response to external pressures, of course. In South Africa, however, it's really part of the overall debate of a grand societal transformation. And actually, that's called an experiment. I mean, after the apartheid regime collapsed, well, let's call it collapsing, there was a big problem how to continue, and that's still a problem. And that's called a grand societal experiment, to actually create a prosperous and equal society in spite of the history of apartheid. So that's the backdrop of this discussion about the third mission. And universities in South Africa are one of the sites where struggles about this transformation are played out. So with that experience, I started to think about the debate in Europe and the United States and elsewhere about the third mission as really part of a larger transformation, a grand societal experiment, perhaps. And so that should be the entrance point for the discussion everywhere, not just in South Africa. Worldwide, you can see this pressure to work with and for society, to play a little bit with the titles of one of the programs in the European Commission's Horizon 2020 program. There are contrasting ways to work on the third mission, and I'm using the contrast which is made in the Anglican Church, or used to be made, between high church and low church. So there is the high approach, where global is important in contrast to local, of the low approach, excellence versus relevance, the global economy and competition versus community orientation. So there are reasons to actually think of a struggle between these two different approaches. They're not just not global and excellence and economy is always the same, is always part of the same movement versus local relevance and community. But it's definitely, these are contrasts which you see in a number of places and play out against each other. So there are struggles between these, let's call them movements, and also partial settlements. One of the partial settlements is to go for global academic excellence, but add relevance occasionally. You can see that in the sort of very well-known, traditional, excellent universities. In the UK, you can name your own examples. In South Africa, it would be University of Cape Town, of course, and some of the others. There's also the phenomenon of what I call centers of excellence and relevance, which are often linked to new emerging technologies. And I have a mention here, an institute for nanotechnology in my own university, which is a top-level institute, but it's also very strong in spin-offs and in societally relevant research. You can even go further, redesign a university in terms of themes rather than disciplines, and Arizona State University has gone a long way to do that. And there's some interesting things happening there, including recently the new school for the future of innovation in society, which is intriguing as the name of a school, but we can talk about the history of that. But so you see various movements and what I call partial settlements. And in the background are changes in modes of knowledge production, strategic science, and various other attempts at diagnosis of ongoing changes. Now I want to turn the tables and say, okay, there are similar debates and tensions, and also evolving practices and arrangements for other types of situations, not just for the third mission. Innovation is a very clear example. Global competition as the main orientation versus ideas and practices like inclusive innovation, and what Pierre Bernard-Joly and Michel Canon and I have called collective experimentation, like in farmers' collectives, in open source, in some of the work which you see linked to users in the world of sports. You can also think of the sharing economy, which we had a very interesting presentation about yesterday by Karen Gregory. Services are rented out, and it's structured, what's happening, by the platform, which is, in a sense, the equivalent of the boss in earlier type of organizations. So there are a number of sites once you start thinking about this. And I'm calling these here, for ease of presentation, sites in capital letters, because it's a type of situation. It's not a concrete site, although there are always concrete sites as well. One example also coming from Karen, which I'll mention again in a minute, is the big controversy between the US FBI and Apple company about access to the sort of basic data identifying users, which seemed, and as Karen said, lots of political language in that debate. And then suddenly there was a sort of resolution, because FBI turned out to have created or let create a new type of software which allowed them access independent of Apple. But the tensions are still there, of course. My overall diagnosis, you may have sort of inferred that already from the way I put up high church versus low church approaches, that there is a dominant neoliberal narrative which focuses on techno-economic innovation, but it has to come to terms with new movements already because of this collective experimentation which I just mentioned. Also varieties of open innovation, which is again something of a fashion. The neoliberal narrative is not homogeneous. There are varieties of the neoliberal project, you could say. And you can refer to varieties of capitalism if you want, that type of analysis. But also within a particular narrative like 3D printing and additive manufacturing in general, there you see that there is one strand which says this is a renewal of manufacturing and it's the new hope of Europe. But there is another strand which says this is a way for people to actually recoup their possibility to produce themselves. So you have the Fab Labs where people can actually, when they have the right infrastructure, create a number of products. And it's mainly about playful things, but there is lots of serious stuff as well, which is now increasingly being experimented with in the medical and health sector. Anyway, so neoliberal narratives, although I talk about it as if it was out there as a dominant narrative, it's not homogeneous. There are varieties of this project. And so another element in this overall picture is an increasing recognition of the social-technical character of innovation and the need for social innovation, and cities and the whole move towards smart cities is obviously an important example. There's another example which I sort of experience a lot, the fashionable interest in RRI, and I experience that a lot not because I've been working on similar issues for nanotechnology, but also I'm now involved in what's happening in Brussels as chair of an advisory group on RRI and SWAFs, Science Written for Society, in Horizon 2020. And so I have access to some of the thinking of the services in Brussels. So they show slides like this. RRI is a process where all societal actors work together during the whole RNI process in order to align RNI outcomes to the values, needs, and expectations of European society. This is, you can sort of see why it's phrased like this, and there's some good elements in it. You can also see the tactics involved in phrases like this. So one element in the tactics is this notion of together, but it needn't be harmonious. The whole notion of being responsible has different interpretations and can be occasion for actually conflicts. And the platform Responsible Soy in the area of genetically modified organisms is a clear example of that. You can also see how RRI tries to insert itself in the dominant narrative, or narratives in the plural. And I just give you some quotes from how the Commission services actually come up with arguments why RRI is important. So it's unit B7, if you want to have all the gory details. Betting on technology acceptance by way of good marketing only is no longer a valid option. So RRI is located as a new and better form of marketing, you could say. Good marketing only is no longer a valid option. They also say diversity in research and innovation is a must to achieve greater creativity and promote better results. That's also an implicit link to gender issues, having more women in science, if you can read between the lines. And they also argue continuous iterative engagement of society is a key to innovation adequacy and acceptability. You can see that they're creating a niche for RRI in dominant narratives in Brussels and more generally. Then you can also see, and this is a remark that I quote from an internal document of this advisory group that I've been sharing for some time. And I'll read it to you while you mention a few phrases. If the choices are too different from those made in other countries, then we won't be able to compete. Particularly, if these are decisions that do not encourage innovation. You can feel how the argument is built up. But instead, if they focus on keeping some of the fundamental values that are important to a majority of European societies, and that's what RRI is supposed to do, this will impact perhaps negatively European global economic competitiveness. So you see a barely veiled threat here. And actually, in our discussions in this advisory group, we try to counteract that argument by turning it around and saying, well, maybe RRI can actually create competitive advantage in a changing world. I'm not saying that we were successful, but it's now part of the work program for 2016, 2017, this argument. So this is a number of details to actually give you a flavor of what I call struggle and partial settlements on this kind of site. And focusing on European Commission work, because there you can see it most clearly. But it's also happening in the UK with the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. It's happening in other countries. And actually firms are getting interest, particularly if they have a history in genetically modified organisms or nanotechnology. A company like BASF is sort of making moves in the direction of responsible research and innovation, but then gets into these sort of puzzles that are visible in these quotes as well. So the next step is this question: is this an heroic struggle between black and white, perhaps? Or people start thinking in terms of black and white because we have all this sort of Manichaean, how would you pronounce that in English? The people, okay. Manichaean, okay. So it's easy to think in those terms, but by raising the question, I actually indicate that I don't think that this is the case. Maybe you could think of another phrase like contested modernization. Johan Schott and I have been working on that concept in our history of technology in the Netherlands in the 20th century. And an interesting idea is that in the early 1900s, the whole notion of an electric motor, which we now seem to think of as an obvious thing, was really an attempt to be more local and flexible in contrast to the big steam machines, which required a strongly organized plant if they want to drive all the machinery. So it was contesting the earlier stream of modernization that was happening worldwide. And there are earlier narratives of heroic struggle, and I refer briefly to this idea of capitalist domination, which is undermined to some extent by labor action and environmental action. An important stream in STS has been sort of looking at the examples of this and thinking about how to understand what's happening and perhaps support such action. Basically, what I'm trying to say now is these movements are there, but don't reify them up front. Think, and that's why I use this title, think of an ongoing societal experiment. Elements of these movements are visible there, but it's an open-ended societal transformation, including these partial settlements. And I'll come back to this next part of my diagnosis. So in a sense, what I'm talking about here is what other people like Sheila Jasanoff, but not she exclusively, have called co-production. So it's not a predictable play. You cannot actually predict outcomes or predict behavior. It's not puppets of the two contesting movements that you see struggling. They're shaping. The performance of science and technology will also shape ongoing struggles and eventual partial achievements. And I was mentioning already the controversy between FBI and Apple. And Karen, as I said before, was saying there's lots of political language, but there is some resolution in terms of performance of new software. And part of the shaping happens not immediately, but through devices, you could call them. ICT codes, and I refer to interesting work of Annalisa Pelizza about the software to actually identify criteria for citizenship for migrants. So the hotspots in Europe, they actually use software in order to help them to classify incoming migrants. And in that way, they actually also shape the notion of citizen and what counts as a nation and boundaries of a nation. And so, in a sense, as she argues, nation states are not based on territory anymore, but on codes, like codes for citizenship. Environmental impact assessment requirements create a sort of choreography how attempts at sustainability will be organized. Also in controversial situation, I refer to Argentinian guy working in Paris, Nico Bayo-Lafitte, for a study of paper mills on the river Uruguay, where in spite of the attempt at criticism, all the actors went through the choreography structured by the environmental impact assessments. So what you see happening here, and that's part of how I see the struggle, is what I have called agonistic learning. I've argued that way back for controversies. And you get learning at the collective level. So there is a repertoire of facts and arguments, values, positions, which will become not just articulated, but also somewhat forceful. And one interesting example is the whole controversy about health effects, and particularly linked with lung cancer of cigarette smoking. And as I said here, you can see when the first phase of the controversy stabilized, the repertoire was about link with health was articulated, was forceful. The actors, including the cigarette producers, tobacco companies, couldn't go against it anymore, but then they created a workaround. So they started arguing that you must have free choice as a citizen. So you should be allowed to go for smoking if you want to. That would be your right as a citizen, as a consumer at least. So these struggles and partial settlements, they add up to what I call an experiment. Because it's, in a sense, it's open-ended, the learning, but it creates, it's not, you cannot specify beforehand what the learning should be about, but it will create somewhat forceful results, outcomes, I should say. So, for me, this all adds up to a program of empirical research, studying various sites and concrete instances, sites in lowercase letters, and that is then not just adding more case studies as STS is used to do. It's informed by a notion of a grand societal experiment. So you start noticing certain things, paying attention to certain things. And important sites, and I've mentioned a few, including the what is called the sharing economy that Karen talked about. You can think of new science and technology actually as sites. And I mentioned bioeconomy here and additive manufacturing because a guy from Liège in Belgium, Pierre Daven, is actually doing a long postdoc project on these two fields using this notion of sites to study what's happening there. And he studies the co-production, which is occurring, where both the sort of political struggles start to change, to evolve, as well as the science and technology involved start to be shaped to some extent. I think there's also interesting stuff in the whole interest in users. Elizabeth Shove and I have called them mythical beasts, like unicorns, which you can look for, but they will always escape you. And there is a recent article by Johan Schott and others about users in transitions. There's a new book edited by Nelly Outzorn and some others, some of her Finnish colleagues, on, as it were, the sequel to the earlier users book of Pinch and Outzorn. So there's lots of both political struggle about the role and importance of users, and some practices, and sometimes certain settlements emerge. But in addition to this empirical program, there is a program of analysis and reflection, which is necessary because of my notion of a diagnosis as a grand societal experiment. Doesn't come as just a nice reference that they can use in presentations like this one. It's actually something serious. So it requires a program of analysis and reflection. And it's the more necessary because it's not innocent terminology, societal experiments, grand or not. And people have been known to comment on these kinds of approaches, that they overlook power play and interest games. And what I'm trying to show, partly because of, in my reference to agonistic learning, that it doesn't overlook them, but it works with them in another way, not as given, but as part of the experiment. And so I'm willing to say that there is some learning, somehow, in and through the struggles, and there is some change for the better even. In that sense, as I will say in my conclusion again, I'm a bit of an optimist, and I'm happy to confess that in public. There's not so much necessarily in all cases that there is learning. There is an overall and somewhat forceful repertoire. And actually, I raised this issue, and I'll quote this older paper, which we contributed to a conference on innovation and firms and so on. And we used the title Many Visible Hands for some reason obvious to some people in the room, I suppose. And I have some quotes here. It's actually the opening paragraphs. You have myopic actors, and these are not just firms in competitive markets, other arenas, public agencies, for example. They have often chaotic interactions. There's limited power of any particular actor to influence outcomes. And then I say it's a small miracle that actually there are some patterns. And the world continues to function somewhat productively. And I have to add the qualifier somewhat, because the world is full of unproductive stuff as well. We don't have to mention examples. And I'm quoting another presentation of yesterday, Janet Webb, when she was talking about heat networks as a collective actor problem, the sort of puzzle of creating and maintaining a common good and all the difficulties there, including what's this called, parasitic action. Actors do try, as she mentioned, to avoid reputational damage, and they want to go with green solutions, and heat networks, combined heat and power installations, are considered to be green solutions. So many visible hands are around, and they create wealth for some, quality of life, still very different dimensions, and perhaps even some sustainability. And we use the example, that's where we started the article with, about salmon swimming again in the Thames, which was considered to be impossible in the contestation of the 60s and 70s. And somehow things improved. But definitely it will not work in a linear fashion, that you can set goals. Actually, the way we try to discuss these, look at these issues, trying to understand what's happening, it would be like action, outcomes at the collective level of all sorts of actions and interactions. And that's been called effet pervers, the perverse effects at the collective level of actions which might have been well-intentioned, but were myopic, as it were. But what I'm arguing here, what we argued at the time, was that there might be a positive version of effet pervers, in the sense of outcomes at the collective level that were not intended, but did occur. And my example of the smoking, cigarette smoking and cancer controversy is an example, I think, of an effet pervers, perverse effects, but with a somewhat positive outcome. I'm sort of happy with the outcome. I have to take a standpoint here, of course. And what is already visible in my reference to Janet Webb, her presentation yesterday, and I'm saying here that in the article we raised the question and indicated some of these perverse effects at the collective level and had only building blocks. Now I'm looking at a feature of the present struggles, this whole notion of green energy, not just in terms of big programs in the United States under the Obama administration, but also green energy in common discussions in cities and in community efforts, and the whole notion of green as a nice qualifier. And actually, what I find very interesting is that companies picking up on this reference to green energy, or just green as a qualifier, and they do so to create legitimacy for what they do and want to do. And it's been called social license to operate. Well, they're out for, and they want that, and that's a very clear pressure on them, this license to operate. But then by using that reference, they get imprisoned by it. They emplot themselves by using the reference, and they cannot escape from the plot they have created. So I'll just show you an example. And in doing so, in being emplotted, they actually reinforce this repertoire of green energy. This is an example of an advertisement of Shell company, where a Chinese boy is shown waiting for his laundry to be washed. And the text, which you cannot read from where you're sitting, actually I've enlarged it here, and it says, the cleanest burning fossil fuel. They don't use green here, but it's sort of, every reader will understand it. Shell is helping to deliver natural gas to more countries than any other energy company. This includes China, and the economy there needs cleaner energy. And so this is an example of how we, Shell, Royal Shell, are trying to build a better energy future. Let's power our future with gas. So you can recognize the rhetorics there, how advertisements are constructed, but you can also see how Shell, by offering some facts about this, is emplotting itself as a good company that deserves to be valued for what it tries to do. But in doing so, it will become accountable to criticism if it would do other things. It would deviate from this path that it's creating for itself here. I'm focusing on green energy here, but there are other sort of examples where companies actually emplot themselves. I just show a few on the screen. This is the DHL, which delivers goods all over the globe and says this is important for the new world. We should improve global trade. This is the text, part of the text, the power of global trade. There's still a long way to go with one delivery at a time. The more we keep on trading, the better it's going to get for everyone everywhere. Wonderful text again, but you can see that there is emplotment going on, self-emplotment. And an even nicer one is Renault, which got a prize for being a responsible company. And the change that they have as what's their perspective is making cars with a conscience. You can read that. I originally read it in a different way. I thought maybe cars will have a conscience in the future, and maybe if they start to self-drive, that's the first step towards having a conscience. But it's meant differently. They make cars and they themselves do that with a conscience. That's why Renault is leading the way in social and environmental responsibility. So, trying to come to a conclusion, I have some final thoughts about what I'm trying to do here, the empirical program and the analytical reflexive program. As I said already, I might be too optimistic, but I'll confess that up front, and then it's up to you to come up with arguments why it shouldn't be, and we'll have a discussion. It's important to actually be more explicit about what is at stake in this grand societal experiment. That would be something that I have to work on and phrase better. One thing that is definitely happening, if you sort of listen to the rhetorics, implied rhetorics of my presentation, is to undermine the dominance of the varieties of the neoliberal project. And actually, in an article that I referred to already when I said collective experimentation, which actually was originally a chapter in a European Union report of an expert group led by Brian Wynne, who will remember that expert group, I suppose. And Pierre-Benoît Joly and Michel Collomb and I had a chapter there on reinventing innovation. And we contrasted the sort of global techno-economic promises and the struggle between them and the race to invest in them with what we called collective experimentation, more sort of bottom-up type innovation. As we said, farmers' collectives, copyright stuff, open, some versions of open innovation. I mentioned that before. And we had a problem whether to actually be observers of these two patterns of innovation. But we also wanted to say, well, this collective experimentation is good. It should be supported more than it's supported. It should be recognized for its worth. And so we ended up with a sort of halfway argument saying that we don't want to criticize the techno-economic promises, that regime of techno-economic promises, but we just want to create more openings for the other possibility, collective experimentation. So we were undermining the dominance, but not by having a big argument that the techno-economic promises were wrong, although occasionally both Pierre-Benoît and I have been saying that in other papers. But we want to have give more voice, more openings for this nice other possibility. So that's one way to, for me, and at the time for Pierre-Benoît Joly and Michel Collomb, to address what is at stake when we do something about the grand societal experiment. So for the analysts like me, like Pierre-Benoît, like Michel, is how to aggregate all this possible empirical research of the various sites and of overall changes, as you can follow them to some extent, and to aggregate that into a picture which allows us, and I've put quotes around us because I'm not specifying who we are, to nudge the perverse effects that occur anyhow and push them, nudge them a little bit in a more positive or desirable direction. So that's my confession at the end of how I want to work on this. Thank you.